Good morning. Welcome to Rhythms of Grace. This is my second try going live this morning. The first one, it told me my phone was the other way, like tall. So anyhow, hopefully I'm all set and it looks like everything's good. So good morning. Welcome to Rhythms of Grace on this Friday morning. My name is Elizabeth Sandifer and I am happy to be here with you this morning, this Friday. It's the last Friday of January. Even though there's like almost another week left in January. To me, I don't know about you, but January always feels like the longest month. Like it just goes on and on and on and on. I feel that way anyhow. Maybe because December is always so busy and January just kind of seems like slow, maybe, I don't know. But I always feel like January is this really long month. And speaking of long, I was driving my son home from school yesterday, and we have like a short way home and a long way home. At least that's what my kids tell me. I think they're probably just like 2-minute difference. But one way right now, there's a lot of construction and traffic going on, and the other way is there's no stoplights. It's kind of like hilly roads, kind of like country roads, and a nice easy drive. There's no red lights. There's not even a stop sign, and that's a really nice way home, but it is a tiny bit longer. But I was taking that way home yesterday, and I was driving there, and I know I've driven that road 100 times or more, and I noticed this before, but yesterday I really sort of noticed it and had a lot of thoughts about it, and that's kind of what I'm going to share with you this morning on this devotion. But I noticed 3 crosses kind of standing erect there, kind of like in a little field off to the side. I've seen them before, I'm sure, and I'm sure you've seen them. You've seen them driving down the interstates and highways. Sometimes they're like kind of sometimes set up on a hill, just the 3 crosses. And I thought about these crosses, and this is what I'm going to share with you. When I first thought about them, of course, I focused on the big one in the middle. It had like yellow chipped paint, faded, probably old. Maybe they've been there a really long time. I don't know. And I thought about this cross in the middle, and of course, I thought about Jesus on that cross. I thought about John 3:16. That's kind of where my mind went. The verse, many people, of course, know this verse. You don't even have to be a Christian to know this verse. People have heard it before, probably. It just says that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that for those who believe in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And so I kind of thought about that verse, and my favorite parts of that are just that God so loved that he gave. And so I thought about that verse. But as I was driving, my mind quickly kind of shifted to the other 2 crosses, that there's 2 other crosses there next to this cross in the middle. And I kind of honestly thought, well, how strange is that there's 2 other crosses there with this cross? Because what are those crosses? Who was on those 2 crosses? And if we think of those 2 crosses, who are we thinking of? All right, we know it's good to think of Jesus. That's good. But what are those other 2 crosses? And we know that there were criminals on there. I think a lot of times I've heard them described as thieves. They probably were more than thieves. I don't know exactly what they did, but their crimes were terrible if they deserved the crucifixion. Maybe they were murderers. I don't know. Maybe somebody knows. I'm not sure exactly, but bad guys, really bad, to be up there with Jesus, crucified the day that Jesus was. And there they were. This symbol of me driving down the road that day, and I'm thinking of Jesus, and then all of a sudden I'm thinking of them, because they're their crosses too. And my mind, as I kind of like was thinking this over, I thought to myself of the next verse just after John 3:16, which is John 3:17. And that verse was, it's the word world is repeated in there quite often. And that verse is, let me just turn one back here and read it to you so I don't mess it up. For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Okay, so that word world is repeated. And I thought to myself, as I thought of that verse kind of in my mind, that's what those 2 crosses were to me driving. They kind of symbolized these criminals, these men. That's the world. And I thought to myself that there's Jesus, this middle cross, and he's hanging there and dying, and he has the world next to him. That's these other 2 crosses. That's these criminals hanging there. Jesus came in the middle of humanity and lived in the middle of humanity, and he died in between humanity. These men, he died in the middle of the brokenness of the world, in the middle of the lost, in this world, in the middle of the ugliness of this humanity. And he still does that. He still comes for us, the humanity, because we are those people. That's us. He came for the world, not to condemn the world, but to save the world. And as I thought about those 3 crosses, I was so thankful there were 3. I'm so glad there were 3. It kind of, I'm so thankful for the one. I'm so thankful for the gift of salvation in Jesus, and I am in no means minimizing the cross whatsoever. But so often we see one cross. We see one in church. We see one on our necklaces, and we see one in our homes, and that's all that we need. That's all that we need. And I'm not minimizing that. But the beauty in the 3 reminded me of us, of our humanity, and that he came into the world not to condemn, but to save. And it kind of gave this richness to the picture of the cross by including the world, which is what those other 2 crosses included there. And as I was driving, I thought of what one of the criminals on the cross said to Jesus, I guess his last words, which were, remember me, Jesus. And certainly Jesus did do that, said that to him, you know, I will remember you on this day. You will be with me. And his words, that criminal's words as I was driving home, were my words too. I thought to myself, it became a prayer to me, like, remember me, Jesus, remember me. I don't know if you ever feel that way and you want to pray a word like that to Jesus. Jesus, remember me. That criminal's words became my words too. Remember me, Jesus. And as I even prayed that prayer, I thought to myself, it was as if I could picture those 3 crosses and like feel this feeling of, remember this, Elizabeth, like, remember this. Remember this. This is why I came. This is why I'm here. Remember the 3 crosses. They point to that. The 3 crosses tell a story of Jesus coming into the world. They tell the story of John 3:17. And it reminded me also of a book that I have. The book is called Messy. God Likes It That Way. It looks like this. It's by an author named A.J. Swoboda. I read it a couple years ago. Later on, towards the end, I'm just going to read you a little blurb from there. In it, he has this story that I actually thought of that day about these crosses. It's about a paralytic man, an injured man. They call him an invalid in the Bible. That's the word they used. And he's laying on a mat by healing waters in a pool by a town called Bethsaida. The story is found in the book of John, chapter 5, and it starts at verse 1. So I want to talk a little bit about that morning. Jesus does heal this man, and I want to tell you a little bit about that story. So let me just read a little bit of this story to you. So it says, the healing at the pool. So this story starts off, sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethsaida. I think I said that right. I might have not. Okay. Which is surrounded by 5 colored colonnades. Okay. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie. The blind, the lame, the paralyzed. All right. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. So this man was 38 years old, probably. All right. And what I want to say about that is, first of all, I want to point out to you before I go further, because I'm going to go further in just a moment. But Jesus came there for a feast. That's what he says. He came there for a feast of the Jews. But he didn't stay. He didn't stay there. And that's what it tells us. Because he leaves there and he goes to this pool near the sheep gate. And there's this great number of disabled people, the lame and the blind and the paralyzed and the needy. And so he comes for a feast where there's excess. That's what a feast is. There's excess. People probably gorging themselves, or maybe they're just having a lot of fun. I don't know. But he comes for a feast and he leaves the place of excess. And he travels and he goes down to the people where there's need. He goes to where there's need. He goes to where the desperate are, to where the empty are. He goes and seeks out the marginalized. That's where Jesus travels. And my Bible tells me way down at the bottom, there's like a little number, and it tells me way down at the bottom that in this pool, this healing pool, that it says, I'm just going to read you what my Bible says. It says some less important manuscripts, I don't know what that means, but some less important manuscripts say that from time to time the people would wait for the moving of the waters, and from time to time an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up those waters, and the first one into the pool after each such disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they had. Okay, so we got that. That's what would happen in those waters. And so here's this man, okay? So I just want to make sure that you realize this, because I mentioned that to you because this was probably a scene of like desperation. And this probably was a scene of mistreatment, because I would imagine that if the first person in those waters after they've been stirred is healed, okay, I would imagine that there's people fighting to be first. And when people fight to be first, when that's their goal, what do? They're like killing each other to get there. We see it, and this is a terrible analogy, terrible minimizing what's going on here. But like Black Friday, do we not see that here in the US? Like with just the greed and people wanting the item, and they're willing to shoot people and step on people and trample people to get that item. It's a terrible analogy, but that's all I had. But we know that people do that, maybe even in the corporate world, to get where they want to get. Okay, but people will do that. Even in our lives, we've probably seen it. People will kill each other's souls in order to be first. That's just what happens. Can you imagine the lame and the blind who are desperate for healing, what they will do to get down to those waters, most likely? So Jesus leaves this place of access to come to the place of the marginalized, and this place of probably great mistreatment, of people just killing each other's souls, and here he comes. Okay, so let me just continue in this book, just a few more verses here. And he says, this man has been laying there for 38 years, this invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he'd been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, do you want to get well? This is how the man replied. This is what he said. Sir, the invalid replied, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. That was his response. Then Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat and walk. At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. Now it goes on and says more about the story. Just about that it was the Sabbath and Jesus healed him, and the Pharisees wound up getting angry, and Jesus disappears. The man never even knew it was Jesus until later on. You can read about that, but I'm going to actually stop right here. Okay. So what I want to mention to you is when Jesus said to the man, do you want to get well? What was the man's response? Sir, I have no one to help me get into the pool when the water stirred. When I try to go down there, someone else is already in there. Now, I've heard people tell me this, like, he makes excuses, and this is a story that we should never reply like that, and that's not how we should answer Jesus, and you know, when we make excuses, things don't happen. And I've heard it kind of said and taught like different ways in my old church culture, okay? But this is extremely encouraging to us, first of all, okay? Because of this, first of all, Jesus sought out this man. There were probably many, many people around, but Jesus sought out him, the one he realized had been there for a very long time. It's like Jesus went to this man who had probably been mistreated maybe the longest. Okay, and he asked him, do you want to get well? And this man wasn't giving him excuses. I've heard that said before. I don't believe he was. He repeated his story. This was his story up until now. This was the man's truth. This is what he lived. This was true to him. He was being honest with Jesus. That's what I feel. This was what he saw. I have no one to help me into the waters, and every time I try, someone gets there first. I don't think he was feeling sorry for himself. I don't think he wasn't not trying to help him. I think he was being honest. But Jesus, this is my life. This is what it's like for me. This is what I see every day. I try and I can't. And there's no one here to help me because everyone's left me. And this is true for me. And what does Jesus say to him? Does Jesus say, well, you need to ask me for help? You need to rephrase that? You better... No. Jesus doesn't say anything. The answer is right after that. He doesn't say anything. When that man tells his story to Jesus, Jesus, this is what it's like for me, and he says it, the man responds, get up, pick up your mat and walk. That's what happens. And it's a beautiful thing. And it's reassuring for us because it tells us that Jesus' willingness to come to us is never about how much faith we have or how much hope we display or the words that we say. It's never about that. It's about who he is, and he is healer. That's who Jesus is. And then he tells him, pick up your mat and walk, okay? And maybe there's a reason that I don't know why he told him to pick up his mat. It's possible. But I just want to mention the mat for a minute, if I could. I want to talk about that. Can you just imagine that mat? The man was 38 years old. It said he'd been an invalid for a really long time. Now, I don't know how long he'd been maybe the whole 38 years. I don't know. But he'd laid on that mat for probably many, many years. And I think back when my kids were little and they dragged like a little blankie around. They didn't all do that, but I had a couple who did that. And how disgusting it got really quick. And my dog beds, the ones they lay on, those get really nasty. And I have a washing machine. And I have like a sanitizing cycle I can wash stuff on. This is long before that. There was none of that. They didn't have that. They didn't even have showers. They couldn't even bathe. I mean, can you imagine what this mat was like? Think of the skin cells. Think of the dirt. Think of the dust. Think of the body fluids. Think of what it was like. Think of how it looked. Think of the smell of this mat that this man laid on. Carry that, Jesus told him. Carry that. The very thing he was just freed of. Jesus says, carry that. Take it with you. Why? Why? Jesus, the man didn't need it to show the miracle that had just been done. He didn't need that. Because if he was an invalid for many years, you have muscle wasting. If you don't use your muscles, they atrophy. And you have muscle wasting and they shrink. They shrink, they get really small. So for him to be able to stand up and walk, Jesus had to have healed the inside of his body and actually like created his muscles to be larger. So he would have had a physical change in his body even by looking at him, much less seeing him being able to ambulate and being able to walk. He would have been strengthened. He would have been built up. He would have been enlarged. And not only that, but can you imagine the joy on the man's face? Standing, maybe he was dancing. Can you imagine seeing him? It would have been shocking. But to carry his mat too, why? It almost seems cruel to say. But Jesus is never cruel, never. He is always compassionate. He is love. So why pick up his mat? So Jesus is never only about our outer healing. He's never about the outward appearance, never. He's far too kind and he's far too loving. He's our healer and he's the restorer of our wholeness, everything. His grace is lavish, his grace overflows, and it makes no sense, often. And yet he's the God of details, and the mat was a detail. One, at first, the man most likely was very confused about what? Pick up that. And it was something in my own story that I was very confused about too. I did not know Jesus until just a little bit over maybe almost 11 years ago, just over 10 years ago at age 37. And those first years, I spent a lot of my time really agonizing over the fact that I wished so much my story had been different most of my life. I wished I'd known God sooner. If only I'd known him, I could have avoided so much pain, so much shame, so much hurt. If only that were different about me, about my story, about my past. And it's only in the last few years since I've known his grace and his love that I've learned that without every single part of my story, I wouldn't know the love and the grace to the depth that I do. I wouldn't know the ability of Jesus to change a heart, to save a girl lying on her own mat. I have met the good, good Father that swoops down and rescues, regardless of how you answer the question, do you want to get well, Elizabeth? Do you want to get well? Because it's never about how we answer. It never is. I wouldn't change a thing now about my story, not one thing. I see him on every page of that story. And him telling me to pick up my mat is him telling me to remember my past. Because he was there all along. And if we disregard parts of our story, we disregard him. Driving past that cross yesterday, that big chipped yellow one with the paint in the middle, tells the story of Jesus, this beautiful gift of salvation, which we are thankful for. He gave to us this gift of his Son. But the three crosses together tell an even fuller story, an even greater gift that he gave to us, that he came into the world not to condemn but to save. The humanity, it tells how much we needed a Savior, you and me, and that he came for our hearts. We all carry a mat. Jesus himself is holy and perfect, we know this. But he too bears the wounds of his own story. He carries the woundedness and the scars of his hands. It's what tells his story. It's what tells who he is. The hands of Jesus continue telling the story of the cross. And your wounds, your past and mine, the mats that we carry, even if we can't see them, even if we hide them, tell the story of the wholeness of the cross. They tell of how much we need a Savior. I want to read just this little paragraph in this book to you of how this author puts it about the mat. This is kind of funny. So I just want to read this to you. I like how he puts this. So, okay. And now he's talking about the same story I just read to you, okay? Okay. I wonder if some of these ambulatory ex-blind thought Jesus was being sarcastic or just plain funny when he tells them to pick up their mat. You just healed me, and you want me to go home to my cesspool-like existence all healed with that nasty old mat I would otherwise throw away or just give to Goodwill? But you do it because this guy healed you, and apparently is more than a healing charlatan. He's more than that. So with new sight, new ability, new walk, a new life, you walk home carrying with you the very thing that represents the old you. Kind of funny, isn't it? In giving new life, Jesus asks us to carry home the thing that represents the old life. Imagine you're that guy, healed, you can walk. What do you do now that your life's been handed back to you as a gift from heaven? You'd have parties, new friends over, and as the evening ends, your friends stand up to leave, use the toilet, and put on their coats. But they stand confused, staring at what they see in the coat closet. There before them stands the dirtiest, ugliest mat anyone has ever seen dangling there. You'd ask, wouldn't you? What is that? That's the story of the old you. And that's when it gets told. I get scared that sometimes religious people leave their mat behind with Jesus, that they deny they ever had a mat. But Jesus says to take it with us, so we never forget, so we never pass beyond that, so we keep being dependent on the one who gave us life. Our mats matter. We point and say, this was me, but look at what God has done. Don't forget where we've been. Don't forget what he's done. It's the hope you offer to the world. It's your story. Him and you. Our stories were never just about the healing after effect of Jesus having been in them, but they're ones of wholeness. Jesus, remember me. He can't forget you. I think Brad said this yesterday in his Rhythms of Grace. Your name is in the palm of his hand. It seems to me, it says our names are written on God's hands, right? They are. I guess in heaven, hands must really tell a story. For God so loved, he gave. You're loved. Don't forget that. And that's my Rhythms of Grace today. I hope you have a beautiful Friday, this last Friday in January. And have a wonderful weekend. Be blessed. Know that you are loved. And if you go to Nature Coast Church, I will see you on Sunday. If not, you can catch it here live on the Facebook page.